You know, I'm glad you said this, right? Because that's exactly what I did. Sugar and slavery, molasses to rum to slaves. And the amount of information, oh my gosh, in this one article, oh my gosh. All them sugarcane plantations in the Caribbean, South America, some in the USA, and they were making rum. Yes, the rum was doing it. They were all alcoholics. African slave traders were getting rum. Rum. They had an addiction to alcohol. They were getting rum and exchanging people for it. That's how hooked they were on that rum. The sugar. Over the course of 380 years of the Atlantic slave trade, millions of Africans were enslaved to satisfy the world's sweet tooth. A sugar byproduct, molasses, was distilled into rum and sent to Africa to purchase more slaves. This is the infamous triangle trade in the history books. Sugar's most bitter legacy is that the labor of slaves fueled the enslavement of even more Africans. So for those who don't know, I'm getting ready to give you a history lesson real quick. I'm going to read it straight from the article so you can see it, so you won't say I'm making something up, okay? Sugar planting, harvesting, and processing is tiring, hot, dangerous work and requires a large number of workers whose work habits must be intensely coordinated and controlled. From the very beginning of sugar cultivation in the New World, there weren't enough European settlers to satisfy the labor requirements for profitable sugar plantations. Native Americans were enslaved to work on the earliest sugar plantations, especially in Brazil. Those who could escaped from the fields. But many more died due to European diseases such as smallpox, scarlet fever, and harsh working conditions on the sugar plantations. A Catholic priest asked to protect the Taino Indians of the Caribbean by importing African slaves instead. So, around 1505, enslaved Africans were first brought to the New World. For the next 3.5 centuries, slaves of African origin provided most of the labor for the sugar industry in the Americas. I'm going to skip down. A healthy adult slave was expected to be able to plow, plant, and harvest 5 acres of sugar. Okay, sugar planting was back-breaking work. Lines of slaves, men, women, and children moved across the fields row by row, hand-planting thousands of seed cane stems. Between 5,000 and 8,000 pieces had to be planted to produce 1 acre of sugar cane. Work days in the fields typically lasted from about 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. and a noontime break for perhaps 2 hours. Also in Louisiana, where workers raced against weather to collect harvest before the first frost and attacks by insects, okay? So this sugarcane production was happening all across the Americas. Now watch this, but mainly in Brazil and the Caribbean, okay? There was some in Louisiana, as I just read. From that, they would make rum. Here's where I'm getting to. The triangle trade. Shall we dance to the sound of the profitable pounds of molasses and rum and slaves? You see that? 1776. Sugar stands at the center of the triangle trade. It was the engine that drove the African diaspora. Slaves of the Caribbean sugar plantations produced molasses that was transported to New England for distillation into rum that was shipped to Africa in exchange for the slaves who would endure the final leg of the triangle, the horrific middle passage to the sugar islands. Okay, I'm going to start right here. Once the slave ships arrived in Africa, merchants could buy African adults, for 110 to 130 gallons of rum, or children for about 80 gallons. Seriously, y'all. Rum cost as little to produce as 5.5 pence per gallon. In 1746, a slave could be purchased for about 5, I think that's pounds, I'm not sure, and auctioned in the West Indies for 30 to 80. Rhode Island alone dominated between 60 to 90% of the exchange rum trade with its Guinea rum. Slave traders owned and operated 30 rum distilleries in Newport, whose casks they loaded onto over 150 slave ships. It's estimated that the slave traders of the single city of Newport, Rhode Island, exchanged rum for over $100 6,000 Africans. Once brought to the islands, the enslaved would produce sugar, yielding molasses to distill into rum to exchange for more slaves in a vicious cycle of profit. So you see, a lot of people was drinking, okay? They wanted the rum. So when it was being processed, the sugar and stuff was being processed over here in the Americas, they would pay for, they would exchange people to get drunk. Addicts, addicted to rum. Alcoholism, a prevalent problem during the transatlantic slave trade. And they would do anything for it, including selling people. Now, I talked about in another video how Africa was depopulated during this time, okay? Before they were able to be completely colonized, they were depopulated by the slave trade. They were giving off so many peoples, okay, until certain areas were being depopulated. And when you depopulate an area, okay, you don't have nobody to do the crops. You don't have anybody to work. You don't have anybody to reproduce. The men would have to marry multiple women in order to reproduce. Okay? It wasn't just a marry. No. Because if someone's, let's say, husband got taken or sold off, guess what? The depopulation. I'm getting ready to read it to you now. Starting right here in Africa. In Africa, the devastating depopulation of the continent resulted in a shortage in the supply of slaves, forcing slave traders to pay more for slaves. Although sugar would not be as profitable for sugar cultivators in the New World as it had been before 1800, it would continue to be cultivated by African slaves until Brazil's emancipation of slaves in 1888. The exception would be Haiti. In the late 1700s, the French colony of Saint-Domingue was one of the most important sugar producers in the world. It sent most of its raw brown sugar to France to be refined to meet the rising demand of French consumers. In doing so, it became the wealthiest colony in the New World, wealthier than 13 British colonies of North America combined. African slave traders wanted that rum. They were given away. Going and doing slave raids on neighboring tribes, giving away people for freaking rum. Alcohol, y'all. The French got rich, super rich, off of the same thing. And of course, y'all know in Europe, they hold alcohol better than anybody in the world, I believe, okay? So they get drunk last, all right? This is why I love this comment, because if you put all the puzzle pieces together, you will know that the transatlantic slave trade, it was a bunch of evil behind people who got control and started doing drugs, quote unquote, we would say doing drugs, getting high. They just wanted to get high. They just wanted to get high and make money. They were out of their freaking minds. Get high, make money off of mistreating people. The African slave traders, the European slave traders. I'm sure some junk was going on with the Arab slave trade. I just don't know too much about the Arab slave trade. I just know about the transatlantic one. So yeah, like I said, it was an addiction. I love this comment. It was an addiction. They kept wanting it. You know, alcoholism is a thing, okay? And I think it's still one of the leading causes of a lot of problems in many countries in Africa. Is alcoholism is a real problem. And just like alcoholism, I used to live in Europe. They drink all the time in Europe, okay? And alcoholism is a problem everywhere now. But I'm telling you, that's what kicked that thing off, that rum. People were selling their lands and everything for that drug. Selling people and all.